Hey everyone, and welcome back to Build UX. In this final episode of the Nutrition UI series, we're going to polish up our work and test our UI for visual accuracy, browser compatibility, and accessibility. First off, I've taken a look at the UI we've built and noticed a need for our global search form. Let's add the modifier class to our search form to open it up and take a look. So in VS Code, let's look at our HTML and find our search form. And we need to add a modifier class of search is open. If we give that a save and pull up our preview, we should see our search form open now. And one thing I noticed when testing this out basically is if we tab in our search form, we have focus on this search icon. And this is great for supporting keyboard navigation, but there's not really a clear way for a user using their keyboard to exit the search form. So if we were to actually code up the JavaScript or the functionality for this, we would want to definitely support hitting the escape key to close the search form, as well as clicking outside. But if we are simply tabbing through the interface, we might want to provide a dedicated search close button. And so let's quickly code that up in our HTML and CSS, just so we can support a number of different paths for closing out the global search. So back in our HTML, let's, inside of our search form, add another icon button. And this will mainly follow the same structure as above, so we can actually copy the submit button down. And what we'll want to update here is the BEM class. Let's modify this to say search close instead of submit. And the type will actually still need to keep this attribute, but specify that it's a button because it's in a form and we don't want its default behavior to conflict with our submit button. So it's important to give it a dedicated button type. Next up, for our screen reader only text, let's say close search form or close the search form as more natural language. And we're still going to have an SVG icon in this button, but we'll want to go into our files here, go into our assets, icons, find the icon close. We'll copy this code out. We can close our sidebar here. Let's paste this in. We'll want to give it still that button icon class. And I think in this case, we'll probably want to target this icon specific for this close button. So let's add a BEM class specific to this SVG. Let's also add a role of presentation. And if we give this a save real quick, we can turn our attention to our CSS. So let's find the search submit. And we can start carving out some styles for these new classes. So we have our search close, and this is going to have the same properties we find in our search submit button because we basically want it to overlap on top of our submit button. But in addition to this, we want to hide it by default. So we're going to use an opacity of 0. We could use display none here, but I think it'd be good to animate it when we do focus on this element. And that way we can have a nice transition. So we'll actually need to change the opacity. Now, since we're just visually hiding this, we want to make sure that there's no conflict in terms of the click events that happen on the search submit button. So to explain this better, I'm picturing that we'll position this close button with its icon directly above the search submit when it's focused. And by default, you won't be able to see it. So let's make sure we add pointer events equals none. And as I mentioned, let's transition using our global transition variable here on the opacity property. So by default, you shouldn't be able to see this. And if we check in with our live preview, you won't see the search button appearing, but let's turn our attention to getting the focus styles in place and make sure that we can actually overlap on top of this search submit button when we need to reveal the close button. So in addition to the search close, let's target the focus state. So search close focus. We want to make sure that pointer events is set back to auto. So that way click events register as expected. We also want to change our opacity, which will animate. And one last consideration, let's give this a save and check it out, is that when we focus on it, we want to basically hide the button beneath it. So because these buttons by default don't have a background color on them, let's add a pseudo element on this close button just so we can basically obscure the search icon beneath it. So back in our CSS here, let's create a before pseudo element on our search close. It'll have no content inside of it. We know our icons are 24 by 24, so let's set the width and height of this element to be 2.4 rems in each direction. We'll set its display to be block. And since the pseudo element will typically fall beneath the rigger button in terms of the visual layout, let's actually position this to be absolute. And we'll center it by using top 50%, left 50%, and then we'll use a transform with a translate, and we'll pull it back negative 50% in each direction to horizontally and vertically center it. And lastly, let's give it a background color of our color white, so it'll hide the icon beneath it. Give this a save. Check in on our progress real quick. So here you can see, because we positioned that before element absolutely, we are hiding the icon. So I believe we'll actually need to increase the z-index of the icon as well. And another thing I'm noticing, a simple improvement visually we can make for both this submit button as well as the close button is let's actually adjust the outline offset on each of these. So first, let's adjust the outline offset real quick while we're remembering that. So outline offset, we'll probably want to tuck it inset to be negative 0.4 rems, and we'll match that down on both of these. So outline offset here as well. Give it a quick check. Okay, that's looking nicer for both of those states. Now let's get our icon fixed up real quick. So beneath our search close block, let's target that icon directly. So we'll have search close and then open up an icon selector. This will also be position absolute, and we'll have the same positioning as our before element. So we'll copy that down. And lastly, we'll need a z-index of 1. Let's check this out one more time. Okay, so this is actually looking really good. So we have our input focused. We move over to our submit button. If we tab once more, we now have a close button. And if we were to wire this up with JavaScript to get all the functionality in place, I think we would be able to accommodate all use cases now with any combination of touch, mouse, or keyboard navigation. So this seems like a well-needed improvement to our search form. All right, so with that taken care of, let's remove this modifier class and get our UI back to its default state. So next up, we have a few code improvements to make. What I've done is read through the code in its entirety and spotted a couple areas of opportunity. And it's important to always review your work and get reviews from others when possible before you can actually call your code fully done. So let's dive into our code and fix a few things up. The first thing I noticed when reviewing our HTML is that we make good use of semantic HTML5 elements. So those would be things like header. We also have form. We have our main and article and aside. One thing that's really important to consider with landmark elements in HTML5 is that you want to not overuse them. And that's because these have specific semantic purpose to them. If you were using a screen reader, for example, it would give you context into where the navigation of the main page was, for example, or the header of the document that you're looking at. But sometimes it's hard to avoid using a landmark element more than once. For example, with our section elements that we have further down in our document here. So in our article, we have multiple sections, and we do the same thing in our aside. We also have multiple nav items because of the center navigation of our app, in addition to the menu links. So what we want to do for these repeated landmark elements is provide either an ARIA label that'll help describe the purpose of those sections, or use ARIA labeled by as a different attribute if we already have a heading that well describes what that landmark is for. So the first thing we can do is find our multiple nav elements in our global header here. And the first one is the center nav. So let's add an ARIA label here, and let's just call this top navigation links. Next up, we have the nav element inside of our menu. So let's give this a dedicated ARIA label as well. and we'll call this the global menu. Next up, let's turn our attention to the various sections that we have throughout our HTML. And for most of these, I think we have a dedicated heading for them. So what we can do instead of an ARIA label is actually point to their respective headings and use those with ARIA labeled by. So for this first section within our article, we have our nutrition information header here. So let's give this an ID and let's call this nutrition info, and we'll use camel case as is common with IDs. For the section that wraps that, let's say ARIA labeled by, and we'll want to point to that same ID. So we say nutrition info there. Let's continue with our other remaining sections and do the same thing. So this ID on the share heading, let's say it is the article share. And above that, on the section, we'll give it ARIA labeled by and point to the article share ID. Continuing on, let's take a look what we have further down. And we have the two sections within our aside. So for this H2, ID of related articles, a corresponding ARIA labeled by. Looking good. Find our remaining section here. So this was our section selector. We have choose article section. Let's give this an ID of section selector and point to it above. Great. And I think that addresses all of the HTML landmark items for our markup here. And that actually wraps up any HTML improvements that I spotted so far. There are a number of quick little CSS tweaks that we can make that will clean up our code and get things formatted more consistently. So the first thing is actually related to our main search class. If we scroll up here, now by default, we hide this with display none, and then we open it back up with display block when this modifier class is provided. What I like to do to avoid any direct overrides is use the not selector whenever possible. So we'll say not search is open on display none. And it basically guarantees that we're not directly overriding classes because these two conditions are mutually exclusive. I also see an extra space after this block of code, so we can remove that. And the same pattern of adding a not selector when a modifier class is applied, I think we need to extend that to our menu. If we take a look down here, yep. So let's add not selector on this. So not menu is open. And I think the same is true of our menu overlay. So let's add it here as well. Great, so everything should still work as expected, just a little bit of cleanup in terms of making sure that the states have no overlap in their code. While taking a look at the menu code, I think just above here, we have our menu trigger section. And these media queries right here, I think what I want to do is break them out separately by modifier class just to keep things nice and cleanly structured. And then we'll reorganize things accordingly. So let's copy this 575 breakpoint and give a dedicated selector for icon large. We'll do the same thing below it for the min width 576. And then to keep things nice and clean, let's move the small modifiers next to each other so we can tell what's going on with those, and then separately group the large modifier classes. Similar to that, I think we have some cleanup around our media queries in the main class name. So you can see here, we have two media queries that are actually redundant. We have the max width 1024 repeated twice. So we can actually move this margin bottom up into this block and get rid of this extraneous media query entirely. And I think I'm going to move this min width 1025 above this intermediate breakpoint where we go between 1025 and 1399, just so it's clear that we're starting at this breakpoint and it goes above, and then anything more specific is nested below that. Last little bit of media query cleanup here is with our card section. So let's go down there and scroll down a fair bit. Here you can see that we actually have multiple class names inside of a single media query. Just to keep things better structured once more, let's close it out and break them out into separate media queries for future maintenance. And I think we have a similar improvement to make with our card arrow modifier classes. So we'll copy these media queries down and rearrange them as needed. So again, none of these small tweaks we've been making in terms of the order of our class names and breaking out media queries actually have a direct impact on the presentation of our UI. It's just good to have a more maintainable CSS file that's more intuitively structured to do this cleanup whenever possible. Cool, so I think that's it for simple code improvements to our CSS file. Another area of need I spotted in our UI when reviewing things after the last episode was a slight z-indexing issue we have when our menu is open. So let's find our menu in our HTML here, and let's open it up with menu is open. And you'll recall that we have the overlay as its sibling, which also receives a modifier class. So menu overlay is shown, and this will allow us to preview the menu in its open state if we look at our live preview. So here everything's looking great, but if we pull up our inspector tools and go into responsive design mode, one thing that we'll notice is that our article image has a z-index of 1, and that's actually overcoming the z-index of our menu. So it looks like for both our menu overlay as well as the menu itself, we can bump that up to ensure that these things stack as expected across all breakpoints. So in our CSS, let's find that menu class. If we scroll down here, the z-index is currently 2. I think I want to bump this up to 3. Nothing crazy. You'll often see people put in z-index like 999 or super high numbers, but there's really no need to as long as you have a clear idea of the stacking order inside of your UI. Another approach that really makes sense is if you're handling a lot of z-indices in your design, you can create dedicated variables that describe what the stacking order is. So you might have a variable for, menu stack or menu overlay stack. That's really nice if you want to look at your variables as kind of a documentation around all the different layers of your design. Here we only have a couple things that even have z-index. So I think we can set menu is open to a z-index of 3. We want the menu overlay, if we scroll down there, to appear just underneath that, but above that image. So let's set it to be a z-index of 2. And let's see if this is enough to get everything stacking properly. Okay, so if we scroll our UI up and down, you can see that image is now tucked beneath. And let's do a quick check across all breakpoints. Everything should look good and function as needed. So menu overlay is shown. We can remove that, as well as the menu is open modifier. Give that a save. Everything should be restored to its default state. And with all these code improvements in place, now's a great time to do a visual check on our work. So we had really robust design mockups that showed the desktop and mobile designs that we were going for. And there's a number of techniques you can use to basically check your live code against those static mockups. So with our live preview here, a really handy thing to do is to overlay the design image directly on top of our work. And that way you can quickly see if there's any large discrepancies between the spacing of elements, the size, the overall layout and presentation. It's a really great way to spot and QA the CSS that we've put in place. So there are a couple of different options for doing this automatically. The first one that I found is Perfect Pixel, which is a browser extension. I couldn't get this to work in the past, so I won't be using it in this video, but this might be a good option if you are using a Windows machine. If you're on Mac, however, I've had really good results out of this free app called Blueprint, which basically allows you again to drop in a static design image and change the opacity and position it on top of your browser. So that way we can check our work. So that way it aligns with what we originally intended. Now, since I'm not on Mac and I haven't had good luck with Perfect Pixel working on my setup, we're actually going to explore a manual approach that works on any system, any setup, and just uses simple image assets and really straightforward CSS to achieve this mockup overlay. So back in our code here, the first thing I'm going to do is go to the top of my HTML, and just after the opening body tag, I'm going to bring in an image with a class of mockup, and we'll have one for both the desktop and mobile. So let's give this a modifier class as needed. The source, I've added in our assets folder, a design reference folder, And this has both the desktop and mobile JPEGs. And I'm just going to close out this image tag directly. Let's copy this down and do another for our mobile mockup. And in our CSS, let's put in some very temporary code just for checking here. So this is our mockup styles. Now, both of our mockups, regardless of viewport size, are going to have an absolute position. So we can say position absolute. And we basically want them to always be centered within the viewport. So we'll say that the left is 50%, and then we'll use a transform with the translate X to bring it back -50%. And lastly, we can tweak this as needed, but let's just give it an opacity of 0.5. Now, to make things a little more automatic, we want to check our desktop mockup at 1920 and our mobile mockup at 320, just because that's the exact dimension we designed those at. So let's just say that at a media query, at a min width of 1920, we want to show our desktop mockup. That means up above here in our default block, we need to say that these are typically display none. And then down here, we can target that mockup desktop display block. And then let's do a similar thing for our mobile mockup. If we copy this down, so this will actually be at a max width of 320, nothing above that. This isn't absolutely necessary. It'll just be nice so we can quickly adjust the viewport when we're checking. So we'll say mockup mobile at that max width of 320. Even though this is temporary code, this should actually be above our desktop class here. And now let's give things a check with our preview. So let's see what's going on here if we give it a refresh. We have desktop here. Let's check our viewport size is sufficient. So we can say at 1920 by 1080. Now we should see things kick in. And you can see some small discrepancies in terms of typography here and there. We'll want to inspect these, but sometimes design tools in the browser render typography slightly differently. Let's first focus on large discrepancies. So here you can see in our center navigation that we have some pretty different spacing. I think this is actually a fault of the original design files that we created, where we didn't account for the 48 by 48 tap target size, but still provided 128 pixel margin between these elements. So actually our browser implementation should be the correct version. Now this headline here, it looks like our letter spacing, even though we did a -2 pixel spacing across all breakpoints, which we can verify here. Yep, you can see here we have -2 pixel letter spacing, which matches our designs. It looks like things are rendered a little bit differently in the design tool, or maybe our layout is a little bit narrower, so we have this unexpected line break. But again, I'm not going to stress too much about slight differences in typography rendering, because I'd rather stick to whole pixel letter spacing instead of chasing the design with sub-pixel rendering or getting too obsessed with that. We want to focus again on major layout discrepancies. So first thing I'm noticing is that we seem to have pretty different vertical rhythm going on in some of these sections here of our design. So we'll want to dive into that. I'm also seeing here on the left, we have a major difference in the margin. Maybe this might be the easiest thing to tackle first. So let's take a look at our side section real quick. Ooh, it looks like our related articles has too much margin bottom on it. So right now, if we go to our rules, we have space oct. I think this is only supposed to be space quad. Yep, and that would be much closer to our design. So let's start here with our related articles class, reducing that margin bottom. It looks like at a min width of 1400. So let's find our related articles here. The margin bottom only comes into play at 1400. This should be space quad. Give that a save. Back in our preview here, things are looking fixed up now, which is great. Let's refresh just to verify. So that gets our side section pretty well fixed up. Let's see if there's anything weird going on. I'm noticing a little bit of horizontal issue on our share section, and we still are troubleshooting some of these vertical discrepancies. They seem to have gotten better though as we've fixed up the surrounding layout. Let's dig into our article quickly. So on our H1 here, we basically set the row height to be auto, and that's just based on the line height of the typography. So I don't think there's anything strange going on there. Let's actually turn on our CSS Grid that we built recently. And you'll see that we had that space quad hard-coded in our margin here. It looks like our design is just slightly above that. Again, I think that's a line height discrepancy between the design tool and our actual browser rendering. So I don't think that's anything that we want to mess with because we do have the margins accounted for correctly. Let's keep taking a look at these elements and see if we notice anything else that needs addressing here. So it looks like something's pretty far off in terms of our supporting content. And I'm wondering if we need to dig into this further. So again, looking at these elements, I'm not seeing anything too out of place. Let's reference our design real quick just to double check. So the nutrition items in this case have a margin bottom of space quad. Back in our design, let's open up our spacing overlay. And that looks correct on this end as well. So again, in our case, I think we have the values correctly applied. It might just be some differences in how text is being rendered. One thing we definitely want to address is the horizontal spacing we're seeing in our social section here. Let's dive into that. So our H3, the first icon button for our social seems to have a margin left of space default. It looks like that's supposed to be space double. So we'll want to target that specifically. So in our CSS, let's find the social selector. Margin left is space default. This is actually true if it's not the first of type. So we'll say not first of type. And then below that, we want to target first of type. And actually we'll have to make a default block and move the border up there since that is shared across all social items. And here the margin left on first of type will be space double. Cool, so that's aligning much better. Again, the vertical height is a little bit off, but that mostly comes down to the browser rendering the layout rules. What matters most is we respected the desired vertical spacing, the vertical rhythm that was established in our design. And if we take off our overlay and adjust the viewport so our mockup doesn't appear, let's just bump this down once. You can see that overall, everything's looking as it should. Next up, let's go down to 320. And this is our mobile mockup. Things are actually really close at this breakpoint, which is great. There's slight line height differences, and that's just due to the browser rendering it slightly different than Figma. Everything is looking pretty good here. Looks like here we actually have a little too much margin bottom going on. So we can inspect what's going on. We'll actually have to manually grab this section. Okay, so I'm seeing a margin bottom here. And it looks like that's being doubled by the article. So on socials, I don't know that we'll actually need that margin bottom applied. It looks like it's actually being applied just on the article share. I don't think we actually want that. So let's find article share. And at this max width of 575, I don't think we need this media query at all. All right, so things are looking much better over here. Again, the slight difference you see in the button layout is due to our tap target size not being considered. So we'll default to what the browser shows here because that's correct. And everything's looking great for mobile. So let's just bring this viewport out real quick. Make sure that nothing broke or is appearing unexpectedly as we change the viewport size. I think everything is looking great there. All right, so to finish this out, let's do a couple different accessibility tests on our UI to make sure that our work is accessible to as many users as possible. So I've switched over to Chrome here. And one thing I really do like about Chrome's inspector tools is this audit tab. So if we go into this audits tab, you'll see that there's a number of options here. We're going to focus on this accessibility audit for the purpose of this video, but I would really recommend, especially if you have projects that are going into production, to conduct any of these other audits as well. They're really helpful and they give great tips on how to improve performance, best practices, SEO, etc. So here we're just going to run an accessibility audit. Let's let this take place. It shouldn't take too long because our app is pretty simple. And it actually looks like we scored 100 on the automated accessibility checks. Now keep in mind that although we passed these 19 audits, there would be additional items that we'd want to manually check. And most of these should be addressed by the work that we've already done from the beginning. because we considered accessibility from the start. So things like having a logical tab order, making good use of semantic elements, having dedicated focus states. And overall, we did a lot of things from the start in both our HTML and CSS to plan for this working out. And without actually even running this audit ahead of time, we actually scored a perfect score for these automated tests specifically. In addition to automated testing, it's always good to do manual testing, which isn't that bad and it's pretty quick, and it actually builds great empathy for our users with varying abilities. So the first thing we can do, which doesn't take much time at all, is to simply tab through our interface and make sure that tab order is logical, as we just mentioned in the Chrome Audits tab, and that we do have dedicated focus styles for all interactive elements. So let's start tabbing through our UI here. I'm going to back up to make sure we can go to this skip to main content. I'm going to hit space or enter on this, and that'll go to the main content heading here. So that works as expected. Let's back this up to its default state so we can continue on tabbing through our elements here. So our global navigation is looking good. If we tab once more, we go into our article content. The first interactive element would be these share buttons below. From here, we should go into our side, because remember that we favored an intuitive DOM structure over necessarily the left-right presentation here. So we have our related article links and then our article selector buttons. So everything's checking out there. Next up, I've opened up our global search once more. The pattern that I would expect for this is, let's imagine we had that button to open the search menu focused. If we were to interact with it with our keyboard, we would want to immediately move focus into this input. Once the search form is opened, this is the state I would expect it to be in. From here, if we were to tab to the submit button, that would be focused. And if we were to tab once more, we would focus that brand new close button we just added. And although we're not adding functionality, wiring things up with JavaScript in this series, what I would expect if I hit tab once more would be for the focus to cycle, as it's called, back to this input and start that pattern over again. And in the same way, if I hit shift tab multiple times, I would expect focus to cycle in reverse. The reason why we're cycling focus and trapping it in a way is because this search actually obscures content underneath it. So in a way, it's kind of like a really small modal. Even though there's not an overlay, it really follows that modal or dialog pattern. So anytime you're obscuring content with something that is open and closable, really you can default to a modal pattern in terms of the keyboard navigation rules at play and for handling focus. And to illustrate that further, I've opened up our menu, and this would actually be a similar situation. So let's imagine we clicked on the open menu button. What I would expect is for focus to first appear on this home link as the first interactive element that we want our users to engage with. Next up, as they proceed through the menu, we would actually cycle focus back up to this close button, and the same would hold true for shift tabbing. And again, we're trapping or cycling focus within this because it's obscuring content underneath it. For both the global search and this menu, we'd also want to support clicking outside of it, like we anticipated with making this menu overlay as a button. And we'd also want to support the use of the escape key so that you can still close it out, even if you're not focused on the dedicated close button. All right, so with our app restored to its default state, the last round of checking I want to do is actually with the screen reader. And so people are kind of intimidated with screen reader testing because it seems like this complicated software that we don't really know much about. But really, screen readers by design have to be really intuitive to use. And if you learn the basic controls of how to move through a UI just with the keyboard shortcuts for screen readers, it actually becomes a really great way to QA your designs for users who rely on the use of screen readers. So here, since we're using Windows, I'm going to use NVDA, which is a free screen reader developed by NV Access. And on Mac, you have access to VoiceOver, which is built in by default. And so regardless of platform, you should have access to a screen reader that helps you conduct this testing and will go a long way in making sure that your UI is accessible. So I'm going to get NVDA started up here, and you'll hear it playing through the system audio. And as we navigate through our app, we want to pay attention to what the screen reader is announcing to us and see if it makes sense, and see if we can imagine using this interface with either low vision or no vision at all.
Nutrition UI document. Link skip to main content.
All right, so you can hear that it automatically announced that we have a link to skip to main content. So I believe we're already focused on that. If we were to hit space, I think we'll jump to our main content now. So you can see that it did update the anchor tag. We would now be scrolled much further if this was a taller page, but we are currently focused on our main content here. Let's refresh the page and get things reset. Okay, and so now that we're reset, instead of using the skip nav link, let's start tabbing through our interface and see if we can understand it. And by default, tab will skip, as we saw before, between interactive elements. A nice feature of NVDA is it takes over some of the basic keyboard keys that you have to make it really convenient to navigate other elements of the website as well. So here I'm just going to use the up and down arrow keys, and it'll actually interact with the text elements as well. And let's listen to what it says as we move between elements.
Banner landmark link notation. Button open search. Top navigation links navigation landmark list with 4 items link food. Link health. Link low carb. Link nutrition. Out of list button menu. Heading level 120 types of berries and their health benefits.
So you can see here that it just read the first heading of our article, and it's not focusable. So our focus is still on the menu button, which is expected, but we can actually read the content itself.
Heading level 2 blackberries. As with all berries, blackberries also contain various health protective polyphenols.
So it's going to read each of these paragraphs. I'm going to skip through these just because it's a lot of text to hear, but just know you can go paragraph by paragraph. And for long paragraphs, it'll actually pause at a certain point and you have to basically opt into it reading more. That way it just doesn't go reading, an entire novel to you.
Blackberry risk factor in human interventions. Studies also show pick your own. Graphic blueberries in a bowl.
Okay, so we just heard our alt text come into play with that first supporting image on our article, which is nice and descriptive so we understand what it's showing to us visually.
Graphic chia pudding with blueberries and blackberries.
And so you can see, because we use CSS Grid, it's following the natural DOM order of the content and grouping these images together, even though it looks like this second image comes after our nutrition and share sections.
Nutrition information region heading level 3 nutrition information. List with 4 items calories. Carbohydrate, 15G. Fat, 1G. Protein, 2G. Out of list share this article region heading level 3 share this article. Link share on Facebook. Link share on Twitter.
So that'll do it for the article content. Let's see what happens when we progress to our side.
Complementary landmark related articles region heading level 2 related articles.
NVDA is actually pretty verbose and does a great job of reading headings as well as ARIA labels. Not all screen readers have the same level of verbosity, basically, of reading everything out for you. So NVDA I found is actually pretty great at telling you things like both the ARIA label as well as automatically reading the associated heading. Other screen readers are less predictable. So a good illustration of that is with inputs. Some screen readers read placeholder text, some only read the label if there is one. So it all kind of depends on the software. It's best to kind of balance guaranteeing that you have good coverage for screen reader support without being too redundant. Here, I don't think it's too disruptive that it reads an ARIA label and then reads the heading to follow that. It did interpret our side. It basically said it was complementary content. So our semantic elements that we use have different interpretations for different screen readers, but they really do help provide more context into the nature of the content that you're reading or focusing on.
Link 15 low sugar fruits high in polyphenols. Link 15 best low carb fruits. Choose article section region heading level 2 choose article section. You are viewing section 03 of 20.
Okay, so here was a great example of our hidden text that we put into place originally when we worked on the HTML. Visually, we only show 03. But here we actually added more context around you are currently viewing section 3, and it gives you more context into what you need to know that might be pretty obvious from a visual perspective, but if we just read 03, we probably have no idea what this is really telling us.
Button go to the previous section. Button go to the next section. Button go to the next section.
So you can see here we've reached the end of our DOM and it'll just stay focused on this final button, but we've actually checked all the elements of our UI, including in the contents. And I think as a first pass, especially for drafting out this UI, I think that we're actually in a really good place with our screen reader test. So with our testing finished, we've actually completed the work for the Nutrition UI series. I just want to say thank you so much for watching this entire series. I just want to give thanks to Giga Tamarashvili, who created the original design that we based this project off of. And if you'd like to get the starter assets for this project, reference any of the code by episode, or view the final code for this project, you can find that through the link in the description for the Build UX GitHub repo. Lastly, if you want to check out the design files we created in Figma and used as our design reference, a shared link for those is also in the video description. And if there were any aspects of this project that you would like to see more of, or things that were not covered in this series, let me know in the comments and we'll try to get to those in the future. Lastly, keep a lookout for the next Build UX series, which is already underway and the first video should be out soon.